Thank you so much, Ambassador Jeffrey DeLaurentis, for joining us in Conversatorio Cubano. It's a real honor to have you and to have your voice included in this discussion, exploration of Cuba's past and present.
Thank you very much, Lillian. Very happy to join you.
So I want to begin with President Obama's televised announcement on December 17th, 2014, that the United States would pursue an utterly new course and open diplomatic relations with Cuba. At the time, certainly for some people, it was very unexpected. I think it galvanized a great deal of support, especially among, even Cuban exile sectors, for the idea that this change in policy would provide a kind of process of democratization in Cuba. And it inspired a great deal of hope. So I wonder if you could share with us what that moment was like, if you could take us back to that moment, and also tell us a little bit about where you were in this tide of history.
Well, I should probably start out by saying that it had been the policy of the Obama administration to change the policy toward Cuba. It was a policy that had not worked after many, many decades, and he came into office believing that we had to make a significant adjustment. And as is commonly known, there were secret negotiations between representatives of both governments that began in the I think May or June of 2013 and ended successfully in November or December of 2014. And the idea, of course, was that Cuba was changing and that our engagement, U.S. engagement, would have greater impact as Cuba determined its future course. So that was the approach. I think the negotiations went much further than either side had anticipated at the beginning. In the middle of that, I would say I was asked to return to Cuba. I had already served there twice to lead what was then the intersection for this transition. So I certainly had been briefed several months before with respect to what was happening. I arrived in Havana, I think, toward the end of August, obviously hoping that these negotiations would reach a successful conclusion, and then we would it would be unfolded as it was, with the two presidents making simultaneous announcements. I think it was at 12 noon on December 17th, 2014. For me, it was a particularly intense day, well before 7 a.m. At an airfield outside of Havana. I witnessed American aid worker Alan Gross, who was wrongly imprisoned for 5 years, reunite with his wife, lawyer, and members of Congress who had worked very hard for his release, which of course was an integral part of the deal that was struck. And there was something, at least for me, extraordinary about seeing a plane with the United States of America markings sitting on this empty tarmac for the first time in 55 years. And so I stayed until the plane took off. There were some conversations with Washington, because of course there was another plane coming down to a different airfield with I guess 3 of the so-called Cuban five, and then a Cuban national, an American asset was being flown out of Cuba, which he was also part of this deal. He had been in prison in Cuba for a very long time. And so after the plane took off, I rushed back to the U.S. interest section to inform my American colleagues what was about to happen, and it was quite a well, it was very, it was, I'd say, pretty emotional. So with over 50 people crammed into a small conference room, I told them that Alan was on his way home and that Presidents Obama and Castro would be speaking to their respective nations at noon to announce, among other things, their authorization to negotiate the reestablishment of diplomatic relations. And I have to say the applause was kind of deafening, and everyone knew that we were going to be part of history in a unique way. And the rest of the day was taken up with meeting with foreign diplomats who were in Cuba, the human rights and dissident and opposition community, and then our own local staff. So for me, again, it was quite it was quite an extraordinary day. I don't know how else to put it.
Yeah, I mean, I, as a mere observer, went to Cuba probably, I think, maybe 8 times between 2014 and 2016. And for me, aside from the extraordinary degree of hope that this whole process inspired in the Cuban people, it was very obvious that there was a spike in the very visible prosperity on the island. There was certainly more food in Havana than I had seen in years. There was also a sort of a wave, a wave of entrepreneurs that suddenly emerged onto the scene. There were a lot of American visitors to Cuba. And so I wonder, if in fact you could explain a bit about how the opening itself affected this change in Cuba and the rise in, I think, the prosperity among the Cuban people, among the citizenry that it generated.
Yes, well, I think this was all part of the approach. When you mention the word hope, I should have mentioned that on the same day, after the speeches by both presidents finished, I heard church bells ring in Old Havana. And I had been told that, of course, Cubans were gathered around television sets at their workplaces to watch on their side, President Castro, and I was told, kind of cheered with enthusiasm. I saw flags draped over balconies, Cuban and American. Of course, we wondered where they got the American flag. So there was just sort of this kind of sigh of relief. In terms of the economic reforms, well, of course, the government had started to make very modest economic reforms. We were hoping to accelerate that process, and our contribution, the U.S. contribution, was the series of regulatory changes. Even though the embargo was still in place, there were many changes that could be made to sort of facilitate more contact, more humanitarian assistance, more internet activity, and more commercial activity as well, again, within the confines of the law. And you may recall that when President Obama visited, one of the feature events was, of course, a very large meeting with Cuban entrepreneurs and American business folks who had entered the market to begin to talk about how this could be expanded and so forth. I think for what we saw, particularly from among young people, was that they were enthusiastic about the future. and many were putting their, frankly, energies into commercial and other ventures, rather than plotting to leave.
Yeah.
And so this was a significant change, and Cubans are extremely hardworking, innovative, creative, and so forth. And so it was quite natural that many wanted to fill this space. And I would assume that had the Obama approach lasted longer, there would have been a lot more activity and perhaps more pressure put on the government to open up things more than the modest openings that they had authorized.
Yeah, I would say, just to add to my point about seeing so much prosperity on the island, in addition to flags, it was really incredible the number of images of Obama that people began to hang and display, not inside their homes, but on their doors and balconies. And I took a number of photographs of those in 2016, before and after Obama's visit. I mean, they just,
Well,
just
it
it's
was
incredible.
look it was an extraordinary visit. People were lined up, I don't know, 10 deep on some of the main boulevards for the motorcade. And to be honest, I'd seen many, how shall I say, government orchestrated demonstrations that brought out a lot of people, but this was much different. It
Yeah.
was so clear that it was spontaneous, and everyone with their with their phones trying to get a picture. Even the limousine, the so-called beast, generated a lot of attention. There were people all around it when it first arrived, and of course his message at the Gran Teatro was quite an extraordinary one. And obviously, we saw some blowback after he departed. 2 or 3 weeks later, there was the Communist Party meeting, and I think Fidel Castro made his last public appearance, saying, "Obama, we don't need you, and go away," and all of that. And the foreign minister claiming or reminding everyone that the U.S. was still the enemy. And then there were articles and things in local media, beware of American cultural imperialism and all of these things. So it certainly had an impact. In
Mhm.
fact, there was a meeting called of ambassadors, diplomats, chiefs of embassies, missions, a couple of weeks after the visit by the foreign ministry to brief the diplomatic community about the visit. I was quite curious to see what they were going to say, given the sort of rumble that it generated. And of course, they provided a very positive. He did this, he did that. We talked about this, we talked about that, and all of my diplomatic colleagues were looking at me as if to say, what's going on?
Right.
And some of them approached me after and said, "Well, did they like the visit or did they not like the visit?" And I said, "Well, it's both." And that's and that's it. But unfortunately, we did lose several months of negotiations, not government to government, but cultural institutions, educational institutions, other commercial areas. Emails just stopped being answered,
Wow.
and that really lasted until well, the visit was in March. I would say September of 2016 before some of that contact was resumed.
Hmm. Well, and then obviously the first Trump administration, quickly, I think almost as soon as possible, reversed course on the diplomatic opening. They got a lot of support from Republican exile leaders. And then we also had these sort of largely unexplained sonic attacks on the U.S. Embassy, on U.S. Embassy staff. And so a sort of obvious question is, what do you think mattered the most in the unraveling of change in general? You know, in Cuba, was it the resistance of perhaps the Fidel wing or the hardliners that contributed to the general unraveling? Was it the Trump reversal? Is it the Sonic attacks? I mean, I think a lot of people have that question. How did everything just dissolve so quickly?
Well, I would say that the administration came in wanting to change the policy. Of course, everyone knows that representatives of the Trump organization had been on the island along with a lot of other tourism-related entities having a look around. And the president had even said at the beginning that he supported the deal, although he indicated that he would have made a much better deal. But then, obviously, with the campaign, came around to a different position and was pretty clear that they wanted to change the policy, and they in fact did. I'm not so sure it had all that much to do with the so-called Havana syndrome. I think they would have done it anyway. There was certainly a lot of concern about that, those occurrences and so forth. But in terms of policy, it was very clear they were going to change it. I guess I was surprised it took them so long, because it was something like June 15th or 16th in 2017 when the president went to Miami and they made this policy announcement, the event that you described. So that was literally what, 5 months after the inauguration, and then it was another 4 or 5 months before additional policy changes, or I should say reversals, were made. So it really wasn't until November of that year that everyone saw kind of the contours of and the extent of the reversals. I think in June, many were surprised that they hadn't gone further. But again, by the end of the year, by the end of 2017, it was pretty clear that they wanted to reverse everything, and in fact, maybe take the policy back to what it was perhaps in the George W. Bush administration.
Mhm. I guess the final question that would be on a lot of people's minds is what you think the legacy of this period of what some people now call the Obama experiment. I disagree with that characterization, but what you think the legacy was, and I'll add that in my own experience on the island and in my own kind of mind, the legacy for many people was deep and profound. I mean, I think as you said, there was an effort on the part of the Cuban government to almost immediately start discrediting what was clearly a shift that had gained traction in all these different ways. And that traction meant a lot to people on the island, especially, as you say, the young people who saw a future that they had never envisioned for themselves in Cuban society. So I mean, I think that the legacy is vast, but I would describe it perhaps differently than you. What would you say the legacy of your efforts too were in leading the opening with Cuba?
Well, I think I guess I could say a couple of things. I mean, maybe more sort of basically or generally, even though you could strongly disagree about many things, including the values we champion, you could still be able to have a civil conversation, find common ground when it was in your interest to do so, and influence your interlocutors along the way. And this is certainly what we were trying to do. I regret that this so-called experiment, the policy was not allowed to continue. I think it would have generated some additional changes along the way that could have spilled into the political realm, again, by the enthusiasm of the population and all of the visitors coming in, exposure to the outside world, the exchanges, all of these things, I think, would have inevitably had an impact on the island, and that's I think what we were aiming for, and I think and also to incorporate the views of Cuban Americans who their ideas about how to deal with Cuba were changing. So it was really meant to kind of accelerate all of these, all of these elements and change things for the better for the Cuban people. I'm guessing that on the Cuban government side, they thought that they know they needed to change. I mean, even Raul Castro said, if we don't change, we'll be dead. I'm sure those weren't his exact words, but that was essentially what he was saying. And I suppose they thought they could calibrate it, control the sequence, the whole thing.
Yeah.
I contend that, in fact, in the end, it would have been very hard for them to do. The reality is that Cuba is very close to the United States, physically, culturally, and of course, with the very large economy we have, I just think that things would have started to move, momentum would have been building, and well, who knows where this would have landed. So, and honestly, I always go back from when I was a kid to a speech that John F. Kennedy made at American University. I remember it particularly because it was on my birthday. It was June 10th. Of course, he made it in 1963. I was born a few years before that, but it was the message that in that case it was dealing with the Russians, that you can find ways to engage. You can even though you find the system that they represent abhorrent, that there were still ways that were the interest in both countries to get on. And that along the way, you could certainly influence the direction of changes that were happening on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Blessed are the peacemakers, I would say. Thank you so much for participating in Conversatorio Cubano and for all that you've done for Cuba and for the United States.
Sure. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be with you.